For the last several lectures, we've been studying the natural philosophical content of the period generally known as the Middle Ages. According to customary periodizations, the Middle Ages is followed by the Renaissance, and then, particularly among historians of science, by the Scientific Revolution. Throughout the next 12 lectures, we're going to be looking at these two latter time periods, the Renaissance and the Scientific Revolution, an extremely important set of periods for the history of science, stretching roughly from about 1450 to 1700. For this lecture, however, we need to take stock of what we've seen so far and prepare some groundwork for the lectures that follow. Now, in my introduction, I mentioned three named time periods, the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, and the Scientific Revolution. Well, the problem with giving epochs particular names is that they often give us a slightly skewed idea of what the period is about. It predisposes us to think certain things about the period. Remember that the term Middle Ages is an abusive term. It's perhaps not as bad as Dark Ages, but nonetheless it was coined by particular people for rhetorical reasons who wanted to separate themselves from a previous period that they wanted to give a pejorative title to. Renaissance, of course, is a positive type title made by the same people who coined the word Middle Ages. In fact, one of the greatest and most successful creations of the Renaissance is the idea of the Middle Ages as something other. Scientific Revolution, as well, is a coined term, and so we have to think about what the content of the time periods actually were, where there was change, where there was continuity, and sort of transcend the rhetorical impact of these time periods, at least the names that we give to these time periods. Now let me say something about current trends in history and the history of science. For the last 50, 30 years, there's been a tendency to try and blur those lines of distinction between Middle Ages and Renaissance, between Middle Ages and Scientific Revolution. Questions like how much is the Renaissance of the 15th century, the Italian Renaissance, a continuation of the 12th century Renaissance? Where is it new? Where is it different? In terms of the Scientific Revolution, historians of science have worn themselves out asking the question, well, how revolutionary was it? How much did it depend on ideas formulated originally in the Middle Ages? How much of it was revolutionary? How fast was this change? Rather than trying to answer those questions now, I think it's much safer for us to keep these kinds of questions in mind as we go through the following lectures, so that we can keep an eye on where change and continuity exists. It would be idle to deny that the Renaissance was in fact a time of great change in Europe. It would also be idle to deny that the Scientific Revolution was a time where enormous changes and developments occurred in the understanding of the natural world. Certainly the people who lived at the time thought they were living in a radically new period. Well, for this lecture I want to do three things. I want to evaluate what the Middle Ages bequeathed for the later history of science. Two, I want to enumerate what the significant changes were in the 15th century that characterized the Renaissance and changed European culture. And finally, I want to specify how these changes impacted particularly the development and the content and the practice of natural philosophy. So we want to start compiling a list of old features and new features to keep in mind as we listen to the balance of the lectures. Well, let's start with what the Middle Ages bequeathed to later periods. A number of these things are quite important. Well, on the one hand, even if some early modern writers, Renaissance writers, Scientific Revolution writers wanted to deny it, the fact is that by the end of the Middle Ages, say by 1400, the total mass of technological, scientific, medical knowledge was much greater than it was at the end of the Roman Empire. There's a huge increase in the amount of material that was known about those three areas. Perhaps equally importantly, an institutional home had been created for natural philosophy in the form of the university, and that university had a culture known as scholasticism that fostered a disputative, inquisitive kind of culture. Some significant questions about the natural world had been posed but not actually answered yet. For example, in one of our previous lectures, we talked about various ideas of what moves the heavenly orbs, what moves the planets in their orbits. So questions had been formulated, but not quite answered yet. So all of this culture, this knowledge, these questions, this method, this institutional home are in place at the beginning of the Renaissance. Well, what happened in the Renaissance that's so important? Well, I'd like to point to 4 developments of the Renaissance. That is, the rise of humanism, the rise of printing, the voyages of discovery, and the origin of Protestantism. Let me go through each one of those in turn. I think, in some senses, one of the most important of these 4 is the rise of humanism. What is humanism, first of all? Well, humanism was a broad-based movement of the Renaissance that included a number of characteristic features. A love of antiquity, for example, in terms of both architectural taste, for that matter, love of texts, of classical style, of Latin and of Greek, particularly of Greek. Remember that the knowledge of Greek had largely fallen out of Western Europe not very long after the fall of the Roman Empire. In an earlier lecture, we pointed at Boethius, the 5th century philosopher, who's known as the last bilingual philosopher of the Roman Empire. What else? A greater interest in what we still call to this day the humanities, the human arts, if you will, literature, language, history, things that aren't part of the traditional trivium and quadrivium. The humanists also had a different view of what knowledge was for. Whereas the medievals had an ideal of scholarly contemplation, the humanists embraced a more active civic life as a desirable trait, as a desirable way to use knowledge. This makes sense if we compare what's going on politically and socially in Italy at the same time, in the 15th century, and starting, of course, in the 14th century. This is the time of rising urbanization in Italy. We think of the great centers of Florence, Urbino, Siena. Well, the humanists were not great friends to the traditional university knowledge. They claimed, first of all, that the scholastics, the university men, didn't understand the ancients in the first place. They complained that they wrote in bad Latin, and that they had, along with the Arabs, corrupted the purity of classical heritage by adding barbarisms to it. Well, the humanist love of antiquity was often expressed by them in a fervor for seeking out new texts of antiquity that were not yet known, translating them, and purifying the texts that were already known by comparison with Greek originals. So a lot of new texts, particularly Greek ones again, were sought out, discovered successfully, amazingly, and studied. New works of Plato, works of Ptolemy, his geography, for example, the work of Lucretius on atoms, on Epicurean atomism, which had been lost since antiquity, and quite a number of Hellenistic mathematicians, particularly Archimedes is an important one. These were all rediscovered, edited, and published. Now, I mentioned Archimedes and mathematicians, and this brings us to another point about the humanists. With their interest in the Hellenistic mathematicians, their interest in Plato now again, a resurgence of interest in Plato, there is more mathematical interest among the humanists. So we're going to keep an eye out for that as well. We're going to see a lot more mathematics showing up. Let me just take a brief moment to correct a common misconception. One still occasionally runs across this. Occasionally, it used to be claimed that the fall of Constantinople to the invasion of the Turks in 1453 drove Greek scholars carrying Greek texts to Italy, and this sparked the Renaissance. In fact, that date, 1453, is too late to be explanatory, because by that time already, the Italian humanists were interested in Greek texts. So it is true that more Greek scholars and more Greek texts were brought to Italy at that point, but they found a welcome home. And that's an important thing. Change doesn't generally come from the outside of a society, it comes from inside. The humanists had to be interested in Greek first, and in Greek texts first, in order to embrace what was then coming to them. But the interest in these Greek texts was already very well developed in the first half of the 15th century. Now, the humanist love for the purity of ancient sources led to a search for the oldest possible documents. This leads us to a rather curious position where an older classical source is often used to trump a later classical source. The older the source, the more pure and the better in the strongest form of humanism. Now, one group of documents, supposedly very old, is called the Corpus Hermeticum, or the body of writings attributed to Hermes Trismegistus. Trismegistus just being a Greek compound word meaning the thrice greatest, or the 3 times greatest. This is an odd collection of Neoplatonic writings, magical writings, we'll talk about that in the next lecture, that it was known first in Greek and then it was translated and published in Latin in 1471 by Marsilio Ficino, a man who was a humanist who was patronized by the Medici court in Florence. Why was there so much interest in this? Well, these writings were considered to be extremely ancient, that Hermes was a contemporary of Moses, and so these were actually before Greek antiquity. In fact, they're not. They're much later. They come from the 1st to 3rd centuries AD, so they're much later, and it's a rather heterogeneous body of writings. But this gives an example of the interest of the humanists in finding these older and older texts. So keep an eye out for that. I should point out one curious thing, that Hermes Trismegistus was considered so important that if you go to the Cathedral of Siena, there's a beautiful Renaissance-era floor of marble, figured marble floor. The moment you walk in the center door, there's a figure set in the pavement of a prophet, and then there are various prophets elsewhere on the floor. Well, that first prophet that you meet is Hermes Trismegistus. Well, the problem with humanism is that its legacy could be a bit ambiguous. On the one hand, an interest in the purity of ancient texts and reviving texts is naturally a good kind of a thing. However, if it's carried too far, that is, into its strongest form, it tends to repudiate progressive developments of classical literature and classical ideas that have occurred since the fall of Rome. In other words, repudiating everything in the Middle Ages as a barbarous intrusion. So, many humanists tended to dismiss out of hand the commentary literature, the built-up, accumulated comment upon comment on the ancient sources, on Aristotle, for example. One thing, however, that humanism did do was that it carried out a transfer of authority. In the Middle Ages, the authority, scholarly authority, was clearly lodged in the universities. That was the site for theological disputation, and the site for theological disputation was also the site for natural philosophical disputation for the most part. But the humanists now transfer authority to themselves away from the university. Many humanists were not attached to universities. And so now a second class of intelligentsia, if you will, begins to develop. Of course, in order for this to happen, there has to be a more stable economy, more leisure time, more money floating around. And that's, of course, something that happens socially, politically, in northern Italy, and then in the rest of Europe during this time period. Well, let me now move to the second advancement of the Renaissance. And this is closely related to the humanist movement, and that's the invention of the printing press. We know that the printing press was invented, the movable type printing press was invented by Johannes Gutenberg sometime in the middle of the 15th century, around 1450. We don't know the exact date, but it's around 1450. What this did was to create a print culture like never before. For the first time, texts can now be produced more rapidly, they can be distributed to more people, and it can be done, eventually, more cheaply. Already by the late Middle Ages, there was a scarcity of books. There was a greater demand than the copyist could meet. In the medieval university of the 13th century, the 14th century, many students made a living by copying out books. By the end of the Middle Ages, there aren't enough students to do that, and there have to be substantial factories, if you will, of scribes copying out books, and even they can't meet the demand. Now, naturally, with our emphasis on reading, we think of the printing press as being a natural, so to speak, a natural invention that would have immediately been embraced and would have been very important right away. But remember that the printing press would have been a futile invention if there had not been a larger literate and more leisured class to take advantage of it. So the invention by itself, the technological innovation by itself, doesn't really help us unless there's a body of, to put it in the rankest terms, consumers, users of the technology who have a need that's met by the technology. Naturally, humanism fed into this renewed interest in texts and in reading. Reading is, of course, critical to the humanist mentality. I might point out that if you open a book today and look at most typefaces, those typefaces are actually sometimes the typefaces that were invented by humanists of northern Italy, or at least the descendants of those typefaces. So the humanists did the same thing in the Renaissance that Charlemagne's scribes tried to do in the 8th, that is, to get a form of letters of the alphabet closer to the way it was in ancient Rome. What they were competing with was the so-called Gothic script, and remember, Gothic is again an insulting term. The Gothic angular script, black letter script. Instead, the humanists wanted a script that looked more like what they thought the Roman script looked like. So many of our most beautiful examples of printing and typefaces come from the humanists of this period. I have to point out, though, that remember that books are still extremely expensive. They remain luxury items due to their high price throughout much of the 15th and 16th centuries. Fine, let's move now on to the third influence on the Renaissance, and that is increased trade and voyages of discovery to two places. First of all, to Asia. The Portuguese sail around the Cape of Good Hope in Africa and open up a sea route to India, the Spice Islands, and China. 1492, an important year, of course. Columbus discovers America. Well, he didn't know that he had discovered America, but very soon afterwards, people realized that this was an entire new world out there to be explored. So if you think about what this does to European culture, all of a sudden Europeans are exposed to lands that they didn't know existed before, people, plants, animals, minerals, customs, all kinds of things that have no precedent in the classical and the medieval tradition. These voyages, by crossing the equator, conflict with traditional Pliny's, for example, account of geography. It says that the torrid zone, the bands around the equator, are so hot that no peoples can live there, and in fact it might not even be possible to cross them. Yet ships are now crossing them with relative ease, and so there's a conflict between all this new information that's flooding in and the ancient knowledge amended by the Middle Ages that had been handed down to the Renaissance. Now, this influx of new ideas and new scientific knowledge continued unabated down to the 18th century, and even past that into the 19th. We still have voyages of exploration and discovery in the 19th century as well. Now, think what this does also for science and technology. On the one hand, you need more science and technology in order to get to the new world. You need better ships. You need better navigational tools. You need better reckoning tools, figuring out where on the high seas you actually are, because it's easy to determine your latitude by the elevation of the sun, but it's very difficult to determine your longitude. In fact, for the next several hundred years until the 1750s, when the problem was actually finally solved, there was essentially no way, reliable way, to determine your longitude on the sea. And this is a problem that we'll see come back again and again. What else do you need? Well, you're conquering a new land and you need to defend it, both against the natives and against other Europeans that might want to take it away from you. So you need better gunnery. You want to exploit the new world in terms of mining, so you need mining technology. You need all kinds of things. Well, one thing that you also need are maps. You need to know how to get from point A to point B. And I'd like to take a few minutes to talk about changes in map making that occur from the Middle Ages to the Scientific Revolution for two reasons. One, to inform you about how maps have changed over time, but second of all, I want to use these changes in the maps as emblems of the changing European sense of their place in the world. If we look at a medieval map, most of them would look quite similar. These are called generally TO maps. That's a modern name. That's not a medieval name. The reason they're called TO maps is there's first a circle that represents the spherical Earth, and then there's a T inscribed inside of that. And that T represents the three waters that divide the three continents. So the Mediterranean, the Nile, the Black Sea, and Don rivers. And they divide Europe, Africa, and Asia, the three continents of the ancient world. Now, the important thing to realize about these maps is that they are schematic. They do not tell you how to get from point A to point B. They don't tell you what's north of what or east of what. They're about showing the world in its entirety as a cosmos and how it's ordered. Not ordered geographically, the way we think of a map, but ordered in more representational, metaphorical, theological ways. For example, Jerusalem is often put in the center because Jerusalem, being the place of the crucifixion and resurrection, is the umbilicus mundi, the navel of the world. So it's often put in the center. Now, moderns expect maps to be like a grid, like a satellite photo with lines of latitude and longitude that tell you how far one point is from another. The medievals did not share our interest in doing that. So medieval maps don't look like that at all. We can take a little bit of a lesson from this now. If we go back to the Middle Ages with our modern ideas of what science and technology is, with our modern scientific questions, with our modern ideas of the way science is supposed to be pursued and developed, we're likely to be quite disappointed by what we find in the Middle Ages. Just as we would be disappointed by a medieval map that it doesn't show us what they thought the outlines of coasts were. But we have to remember that they had their own questions and their own needs. Their questions are not our questions. Their preoccupations and their interests are not our preoccupations and our interests. And that's the sort of thing we want to keep in mind all the time doing the history of science. It turns out that in the modern era, we actually have maps that are somewhat like the medieval TO diagrams. Think about a subway map. If you're sitting on the subway, you have a line with points on it that show the different stations. The geographical position of that train line doesn't really matter. The train may curve, but that's not necessarily shown on the map because you don't care. You just want to know what order the stations are coming in. You don't really care what the north-south, east-west deviation of the train line is. That's something to keep in mind. The map serves a function. It serves a function for the user. Now, starting around 1300, about the time that the voyages of exploration and greater trade begin to occur, the portulon maps show up. Now, these portulon maps are intended to show the outlines of coasts because they were intended for mariners sailing, hugging the coastline to get from one port to the next. They don't tell you very much about the interior of the country. In fact, often the interiors are left totally blank because nobody cares. You don't really care where the Alps are if you're sailing a ship because you're not going to sail your ship into them. You only care about the outline. These porcelain maps also tend to have rosettes of lines that show the closest distance, the easiest way to sail between points. In Europe now, these porcelain maps grew hand in hand with the voyages of trade and exploration. In other words, what I'm saying is, when people needed a different way of thinking about maps, of thinking about geography, they created a new kind of map. It's not a simple matter of throwing away the TO diagram because it's wrong and then creating a porcelain map. It's a matter of you're asking a different question. You're trying to figure out how to sail. And so the porcelain map answers the questions you want. The TO map doesn't. On the other hand, the porcelain map doesn't show you the philosophical, theological, schematic organization of the Earth into a cosmos. So one map for whatever purpose you actually want. Well, fine. Now let me conclude with the fourth development of the Renaissance, and that is the Protestant Reformation. We generally date the Protestant Reformation to 1517, when Martin Luther nailed his theses to the church door in Wittenberg. The Protestant Reformation fractured Western Christianity and deeply altered the institutional framework in which natural philosophy had been pursued. Think about what happens. More or less unified Christianity, in the Latin West at least, for over 1,000 years, produces such things as the universities, produces a coherent theology, a disputative theology, and now all of a sudden you have a group of people who split off from that church and form their own church, which is identified, in fact, is defined by its difference from the old structures. What does this mean? Well, it means, first of all, that the theologians on both sides are now distracted. Rather than the medieval theologian that has the leisure to pursue disputative questions about the structure of the cosmos, the theologians on the Catholic side have to defend Catholic doctrines and dispute the Protestant ones. The ones on the Protestant side have to dispute the Catholic doctrines and produce, de novo, a Protestant theology. It also fractures the institution of the universities in the sense that now Protestants can't go to the Catholic universities, so they either have to take them over and make them Protestant universities, or they have to found new ones. And of course, when a new institution is founded, it's almost always quite different from the old ones, even if it uses the old model. So now the whole idea of a university system has been changed as well. Protestantism affected the history of science in diverse ways, and its overall impact is still being debated by historians of science. It's one of the great variables in this period in the scientific revolution. The importance of religion, of theology, remains very strong throughout the Renaissance and the scientific revolution, but what the difference is between Catholic and Protestant theologies for the history of science is still a very interesting and an incompletely answered question. So we're going to have to keep an eye out for how the influence of theology, the use of theology in natural philosophy changes over this time period. And we'll have to think now, for the first time, about what the religion of the practitioners happens to be. Are they Catholics? Are they Protestants? How does that change their view of the world? Well, finally, in sum, we can say that the period from 1450 to 1700 saw the introduction of many, many new ideas and numerous challenges to older ideas. Intellectually, the period is one of both change and continuity. And I think rather than making blanket statements about whether it was a change or whether it was a continuity, let's just look at some of the historical information to decide for ourselves what's carried over, what's not. It's very strange, it's very unusual to imagine that there could be a complete break. On the other hand, if there's complete continuity, then why are we studying the history of science as a developing thing anyway? So clearly the answer lies somewhere in the middle. Let's watch for individual signs of change and continuity and what they mean as we progress through the last 12 lectures. Well, in our next lecture, we're going to begin our study of Renaissance natural philosophy, and we're going to start it in what you may think is a rather peculiar area, that is, the subject of magic.